Unemployment. I'm going to talk to you about unemployment, what's essentially in Chapter 8 of your text, the definition of unemployment, how it's measured, the recent trends, the types, the causes, the impacts of unemployment, and some economic policies and management policy from the government to reduce unemployment. When we talk about measurement, we talk about three variables in order to talk about two ratios that we measure unemployment by. One is the unemployment rate itself and the participation rate. In order to explain what the participation rate is all about, I must talk to you about the labour force firstly. The labour force is defined as persons above 15 years of age who are paid 1 hour per week, but it doesn't include people who are studying, age over 15, that have got domestic duties, not willing or able, for example some people are sick or disabled, for example, and of course the retired. The participation rate, defined as the labour force, the people who are able and willing to work, over the working age population. It's expressed as a percentage of the working age population, so the people that I excluded a second ago are also included in the working age population, namely the people that are retired and the ones that are studying and so forth. So to refine, it's people aged 15 and older. They are working or seeking work. That's an important bit. They're actively engaged in that. It's expressed as a percentage, and currently, as of February 2013, the ratio is 65.1. Other criteria which classifies people in the labour force are those that are checking regular advertisements, they're willing to respond to job advertisements, and they must be registered with an employment agency who are looking work for them. And now we look at the unemployment rate itself. It's expressed as the number of persons employed divided by the total workforce. Expressed as a percentage, and there's people out of work and seeking work. Okay, you may be out of work but not seeking work, that makes a difference. What I'd like you to do is to go to section 8.2 and complete review questions 1 and 3 before moving on. By looking at the recent performance, I have grabbed a graph from the Reserve Bank of Australia. You can get statistics from a whole range of areas, namely the Reserve Bank, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Trading Economics, and the Tasmanian Labour Market Review. Let's go and check some of those. Here's the Reserve Bank of Australia chart pack site. This is the one I showed you before, but here you can see unemployment rate going down and trending down, but even though here since 2009 we had it going back up, but it sort of crept down. Currently it's going a little bit up, and the participation rate, the pink line, has been going up consistently. Since 2005, when we experienced labour shortages and there was more enticements to get back into work, the government managed to increase the participation rate to above 65, where it currently sits. Another common place to look for key economic data is from the ABS site, the key economic indicators. Looking under labour force demography section, you can see employed persons. That's how many people are employed. That's 11.588 million people are in work in Australia. The 0.01% here represents the previous change to the previous period, and this is the period change over the last year. So it's gone up by 0.1% in the last 3 months, and the last year it's gone up by 1.2%, which isn't too bad. The participation rate has barely moved, and the unemployment rate, you can see here, currently is 5.4%. It didn't move last quarter, but it has increased by 0.2% since last year. The other site which I like is this one, the Trading Economics site. and I've clicked on the unemployed person, so this is just looking at it in a different way. You can see here unemployment back in only about a year and a half ago was below 600,000 people. So that's how many people were out of work, 600,000 people. When you put it like that, it sounds like quite a lot. And you can see that it's been trending up. But this particular site, if you press on the trend button, it gives you a really useful bit of data here. Right? So you can see here that the unemployment rate, the unemployed, the level of unemployed in this trend line is going up. And this is the raw data represented as a line graph. So that's an important bit of data to look at. Another site is the Tasmanian Labour Market Review site that has Tasmanian labour statistics, which is really important too. That's fairly up to date here. They talk about the participation rates here and unemployment rates relating to females and males. You can see it's virtually the same now, but at some stages they have come apart here. So in this particular instance, the unemployment rate for females was less, but traditionally it's always been higher. There's some other good information here, talking about the internet vacancy index rates between Tasmania and Australia. You can see that the vacancy rate is for Tasmania is at a lower rate than it is in Australia, which implies that there's less jobs available in Tasmania than all of Australia. They provide other indicators which give an indication of where the future unemployment rate might go in terms of judging the level of economic activity, but you can see that Tasmania is lagging behind the rest of Australia relating to building approval, so that means our building sector might be down. And similarly with the job vacancies here, the job vacancies here in Tasmania are higher than they are in Australia. So let's keep going. I'd like you to check your understanding in section 8.3 and complete review questions 1 and 2, please, before moving on. Okay, now let's look at types of unemployment. There's quite a few. The first one I wanted to discuss is structural unemployment. So, due to structural changes in the economy, which means that, for example, a changed level of technology, how that's been applied, a change in demand for a particular product, which may mean that some job skills don't match the new industries. An example there would be the current forest industry is being restructured or should be restructured, and those people are going to be out of work because there's been a structural change in the economy where there's not much demand for their product, and it's going to be very difficult to retrain them and to get them in the new industry, so they're going to be unemployed for a while. Cyclical unemployment goes with the business cycle. So when the business cycle decreases, there's falling demand in the product and services, which means less jobs. Seasonal, as the name implies, things like fruit picking and those sort of things, they come on in a certain time of year, and when they're not needed, for example, people that work in the tourism industry, for example, doing rafting trips down the Franklin River, they wouldn't be getting much work in winter, and therefore they would be unemployed. Another type of unemployment is frictional unemployment, and that's essentially when people are changing jobs and in that period of time they're out of work. There are also other types of unemployment that I haven't mentioned. They're important, but in the context of what we're learning in our course, they're not so important. There's hidden unemployment, for example, people who are unable to get work. They're the ones that have been discouraged and not looking for work, and therefore drop off the radar and are not part of the participation rate anymore. Underemployment, remember that the definition of unemployed or employed means that you're working 1 hour a week. So obviously if you want more work, then you may be looking for work. You've got work, but you're looking for more work. There's a long-term unemployed who have got long-term issues. For example, they've been out of work for a while, or they're in an industry where it's hard for them to retrain, and that happens to be largely in the less skilled and semi-skilled areas, which also make up the hardcore that have been out of work for too long and their skills ain't relevant anymore. When we talk about unemployment, we always relate that to inflation, and one thing I must point out is that they are inversely related, and your knowledge of the business cycle would bear that out. So when we've got a high inflation rate, the unemployment rate is low, and correspondingly when the unemployment rate is low, the inflation rate tends to be high. So there's an inverse relationship that's really important to realise. Okay, time to stop again. Review question on section 8.4, question 1 and 2 please, before going on. Okay, causes. Let's look at some causes of unemployment. Well, the most obvious one is the cyclical unemployment, which relates to the level of economic growth. Remember that if there is a downturn in demand, right, it means then we need to have less labour. So that's what I mean by derived demand. The demand for labour is derived from the product or service that the labour supports. The government can influence the macroeconomic policies and the direction of unemployment depending on when they decide to intervene from a fiscal perspective, or when the Reserve Bank intervenes in terms of the monetary perspective. So a classic example is during the GFC, the government spent lots and lots of money to try and revive the economy, to get it back into operation, and in that way they saved lots of jobs. Sometimes there are some constraints on economic growth. This can be seen two ways. Sometimes there's not enough people there to be employed, and another way of looking at it is when the economy doesn't have enough jobs for its people. Rising participation rates. So when the economic times are better, more people are enticed to come into the workforce. So you can have a rising participation rate which can increase the unemployment rate even if the level of employment is the same. Structural change, we've mentioned that before. A good example, as I mentioned before, was the forestry industry in Tasmania. They're undergoing big structural changes. So when that happens, a lot of people then have to retrain and do other things. When there's technological change, this happens in Australia a lot because labour is so expensive. There's a substitution of capital for labour. There can be, or has been, an inadequate level of training and skills to get people trained up in those higher order or high thinking jobs. There has been an increase in labour costs, especially in Australia, and our productivity, determined as the output of goods and services per labour cost, and that productivity has been trending down, and there is seen to be by some then inflexibility of the labour market. It is harder for employers to employ people, and in 2005 John Howard had the work choices legislation to try and get more flexibility in the labour market, with a major aim to decrease the labour costs, and that's been reversed by the current Labor government. These last 5 causes are the most relevant to Australia today. There's lots of technological change. We're not keeping up with our training and skills. The big thing, we've got increase in labour costs, especially on the lower skilled area, which makes everything more expensive. Now let's look at some costs of unemployment. The most pertinent and obvious one is opportunity costs. So if somebody's not working and producing and contributing, that means that there's a lot of opportunities foregone, which leads to lower living standards. So if people are not being paid as much as they could be, they're not satisfying their wants and needs, and therefore living standards will fall. Over time, there can be a decline in labour market skills, especially if they've been out of the market for more than 3 to 6 months. It obviously costs the government lots of money for the dole and other support services, and they've also been handing out subsidies to employers to entice them to hire more people to get them in the workforce. It also tends to lead to lower wages growth, although employers would say in Australia that the wages growth has been too high. Some social costs. We have increased inequality between, the gap between the rich and poor increases. Because people with money, they keep on earning it and making more of it. There is more unemployment for disadvantaged groups, youth, the indigenous, new immigrants, the lower skilled, and also some regions, in especially the regional areas, they tend to be hurt more so. There tends to be increased debt, so if I'm out of work all of a sudden, I still have to service my housing loan, for example. That tends to be the big one, especially if I'm living in a area like Melbourne or Sydney, where housing costs are really high, and an average mortgage out that way might be $300,000 or $400,000. People in an extreme case can be forced out of their homes, and there's a definite loss of skills, and which leads to boredom, loss of self-esteem, poor health, and traditionally also leads to increased levels of crime. I want you to stop again. In section 8.7, I want you to do question 1 and 3, please, before moving on. Now let's look at government managed lastly. As I mentioned before, the Australian government can use government spending and taxation to manage the economy. So when the business cycle is trending downwards and they're trying to address the problem of unemployment, they will increase government spending and decrease taxes to allow more money in the circular flow. The Reserve Bank can decrease interest rates to make it easier to spend and lend, and to discourage people from saving their money as interest rates are lowered. The government also engages in microeconomic reform, looking at specific industries or sections of the economy. So deregulations to taking laws away, or red tape if you like, to make it easier for business to operate. And these days they're also talking about green tape, or the environmental regulations that currently exist. We can have tax reform, paying less taxes and so forth. Reductions in tariffs, which is the tax that we charge overseas products. So if we reduce those, that means that consumers can buy these imported products more cheaply. And over the years, we've also had privatisation of government-owned businesses like Telstra and Qantas. And lastly, labour market policies in relation to industrial relations and education and training. So they've changed through the Fair Work Australia Act of 2010, which has made it fairer for both employees and employers. But currently the employers, I think, are saying that we need more flexibility. Really what that means, they want to decrease their costs, which are internationally relatively very high. Okay, that's all I've got for you today.